7 o'clock, and we are the faithful remnant who have made it through 6 weeks of learning about liturgy and worship, expertly guided by Ben. And we've come now to the mid to late 20th century. So all a bit too close to home for comfort, I imagine, for many of us. As we are taken through the ups and downs of liturgical reform in the Church of England. And Ben, great to have you with us, and we look forward to your session tonight. Over to you.
Thank you, and welcome to our final session. There's hardly few who've made it. But thank you all for joining me on this journey, charting the worship and music of our church. It's been topsy-turvy, with periods of incredible inspiration and periods of, let's be honest, inaction and dullness. But the 20th century bucks that trend. As we journey through it, we see colossal societal and technological change drive both church and music in directions few could have ever comprehended at the start of the century. The fallout from the failure of the ratification of the 1928 prayer book started a journey for the Church of England, which continues to this day, one where unity and certainty, although never assured, seem to fragment further, with various weakening and disintegration of its place in the fabric of national life. We talk about music, but rather than wax lyrical about composers such as Howells, Britten, or Rutter et al., we'll discuss topics affecting church music, as trying to discuss single composers in this period will just be too much for such a short time together. Many of you already know their narratives. So the time we've got left, I just want to kind of focus on some key issues rather than getting bogged down in musical theory and composition. But what I'd really like to conclude tonight with is some questions. I'd like to consider together, however briefly, the state of cathedral music now and cathedral worship, and discuss where we think it might go next. Just before I kick off, can you all see the slides? Marvelous. So we ended our last session with parliamentary defeat of the proposed 1928 book. The failed book gave the Church of England breathing space, space to reflect not only on its liturgy, but its governance and the relationship between church and parliament. George Bell reflected on the failure in his biography of Archbishop Randall Davidson. Bell believes that a deep Protestantism of the English people, which he believed to be irrational in its fear and distrust of Rome. Henry Henson of Durham concurred, stating that Englishmen are not inevitably Episcopalian as the Scots are inevitably Presbyterian and the Irish inevitably Papists, but au fond, they are Erastian, Bibliotreus, and always fiercely anti-papal. Bell saw as the cause of failure the lack of compromise offered by Low Churchmen to accommodate requests of Anglo-Catholics, then at the height of its influence and organization as a movement. There is, however, a third way which hasn't received enough coverage. In giving evidence before the Archbishop's Commission on the relation between church and state in 1931, the Congregationalist historian Bernard Manning, not the comedian, asserted, "We do not believe that Christ's flock can both enjoy the advantages of an Erastian establishment of Henry VIII and Elizabeth and Charles II's church and ecclesiastical liberty." The clear implication was that the bishops were, to be charitable, attempting to run with the hounds and the hare, or in a way that would please me more, attempting to have their cake and eat it. The feebleness of the bishops in refusing either to accept the obedience of an Erastian solution situation of an established church required, or to break the manacles of the state connection and make the church master of its entire domain, led more and more people to consider the positives of disestablishment. Henley Henson, Bishop of Durham and contrarian of the Church of England, was a surprised and noted convert to the cause that had recently been imposed on Wales in 1920 and taken up half a century before in Ireland. One of the unintended consequences of this period is the weakening of the hold of the 1662 rite. So vigorous the argument that change and supplementation was necessary that the prayer book itself would be supplanted by the alternative or supplementary rites. The creation of the Prayer Book Society in 1972 has helped keep pressure on to retain and use the 1662 rite, but by then the damage had been done. What's interesting to note is the revision going on in other Anglican provinces, both official and unofficial, which were happening in tandem with those of 1928 in England, and had an effect on what would come to be proposed in the post-war period. The Bombay liturgy, produced by E.C. Ratcliffe and J.C. Winslow, received endorsement and began use in the Diocese of Bombay in 1923, and was authorized for use within the entire province of India by 1933. It's here that we first see in an Anglican liturgy the use of the Eucharistic acclamation, "Thy death, O Lord, we commemorate, thy resurrection we confess, and thy second coming we await." Luckily and handily made snappier in "Christ has died, Christ has risen, Christ will come again." The Scottish Episcopal Rite's use of an explicit epiclesis, petitioning the Holy Spirit's sanctification of the oblations, becomes normative in the rites of South Africa in 1929, Ceylon in 1933, Japan 20 years later in 1953, Canada and the West Indies in 1959, and India in 1960. The US Episcopal Church, like our own, remained in a state of flux, producing a conservative prayer book revision in 1928, then beginning an experimental development in the late 1950s before coming to a radical book based on the centrality of the Eucharist and baptismal covenant in 1979. The TEC's decision to prohibit the use of their 28 book was an act that caused irreparable harm, which, combined with other conservative doctrinal concerns, led to internal schism that has led to the present issues and divisions within the Anglican community in the United States. It's only in the last few years that the 1928 American prayer book has been slightly rehabilitated. We touched upon the growing centrality last time of the Eucharist in Anglican liturgical life. The growth in incarnational theology and its espousal by Gore and William Temple, following on from the 19th century inheritance of Morris, Westcott and Hort, recognized the real presence, and both spiritually and practically gave increased importance to the mysteries of the altar. Whilst in nonconformity, the pulpit dominated the altar, as can be seen in the many layouts of nonconformist places of worship, it never took off that way in the Church of England. Through works such as Oliver Quick's The Christian Sacraments, and, as we can see on the slide, Gregory Dick's The Shape of the Liturgy, we see thinking develop on the sacrament of the Eucharist, both spiritually and liturgically, moving in tandem with experimental movements, such as the parish communion associated with A.G. Herbert and the Theological College at Kelham. This developed into the wider parish and people movement in the 1930s. A second movement, slightly later, the house church movement, associated with Ernest Southcott even, attempted to combine the celebration of the Eucharist with evangelism by taking the church to the homes of his parishioners in the new housing estate of Halton on the edge of Leeds. A third experiment in the late 50s and 60s at Clare College, Cambridge, known as the Clare College Liturgy, was a manual espoused by John Robinson and Charlie Moore, attempting to bring life to the liturgy to life in both senses. So, as the quote goes, so that the Holy Communion may occupy its central and creative position in the common life of the community. Robinson later codified this in his book, Liturgy Coming to Life, in 1960. And if you kind of reflect on where Robinson went next with South Bank religion or the South Bank movement, you see some, what I would feel now, quite conservative ideas of that being espoused in Liturgy Coming to Life. The fourth movement, which is interesting, which regrettably we don't have much time to go into, was an experimental liturgy broadcast on ITV, which was worked up by a collective of academics influenced by developments in the United Church of South India, which remained somewhat faithful to the prayer book and reflected a broadly evangelical acceptance of necessary liturgical reform. What we see in all these developments, particularly though in the parish communion and parish and people movement, is a push to a centrality of the Eucharist in the liturgical and spiritual life, a Eucharistic people for a Eucharistic church. As A.G. Herbert wrote, the celebration of the Holy Eucharist with the communion of the people in a parish church as the chief service of the day, or better, as the assembly of the Christian community, the worship of God. This statement demonstrates a belief that the quiet 8 o'clock celebration of most churches and the non-communicating high masses in some more exotic shrines were not fully expressing the koinonia, the communion or fellowship of the local body of Christ. As we know, there is some truth in this. Herbert too was concerned in societal growth that the centrality of the Eucharist could offer, encouraging a parish breakfast to follow the Eucharist, where parishioners and clergy could get to know one another and grow as community together in Christ. He raised some serious theological considerations too. The Eucharist needed to fully demonstrate the full participation of the people of God. The church surrounding the altar rehearses the mystery of divine agape, whereby man has been redeemed and the redeemed fellowship constituted as the body of Christ. The Eucharist sums up the whole gospel of redemption as the sacramental showing forth of the one sacrifice of Christ and of the offering up of the members of Christ through union with him to be a reasonable, holy, and living sacrifice to God. The participation of the laity needed expanding. Whilst reading the epistle could be delegated to a lay person, as we saw in previous centuries, that was the parish clerk because no one else could read, the laity remained, to all purposes, spectators with limited room for participation in the 1662 rite. The offertory was seen as one place where general participation could be greatly encouraged. Harkening back to the early church, and to go slightly off script, I'm not completely sure how well-rooted this is, but they really did believe in it. Harkening back to that time where the oblations and alms were brought forward from the people, from the midst of them, Herbert attempted to restore this, with each member of the congregation placing a wafer into the ciborium or onto a paten as they entered church. Now, having seen this attempted, albeit on behalf of the congregation by size persons, I'm unconvinced it hits the mark. An offertory procession, however, where the bread in wafer form, wine and water are brought from the body of the people by the people to the altar, is, I must admit, more symbolically inclusive. Although, as ever, it can mould into a quasi-liturgical ministry regulated by rota, which sort of destroys the liturgical and theological idea behind it. There's a great description of this taking place at a parish and people church, St. John's in Newcastle upon Tyne. This happened in 1937, and that's the first quote on screen, which I'll read. Such a procession, the offertory procession, helps the people to realize the significance of the offertory by giving it a visible, dramatic form. It restores the act of offering to its true importance and marks it as the foundation of the whole Eucharistic action. It has the additional value of giving a share in the action of worship to a greater number of the laity who need not all be of the male sex. I think that came as a surprise. That end bit came as a surprise to me when reading it. Like even back as far as then, we have to be totally honest. It's a Catholic parish. Talking about gender and the visibility of people going to the altar in the quasi-liturgical ministry other than men, did catch me a bit unawares. I didn't realize that we'd been kind of that tuned into it. So you live and learn. Michael Ramsey, whilst a canon professor at Durham, in his Durham Essays and Addresses, raises some serious theological questions as to the popularity of the parish communion. His caveat was the reduction of teaching inevitable when preaching is limited to a mere 7 or 8 minutes. The brevity requiring a sermon package to make one point briefly, often without time for depth needed to convince. A.L. Rouse notes that one of the attractions of the Elizabethan settlement was the change from the Mass to the sermon, leading to an increase of reflection and edification, a stimulus to education and the active virtues. E.L. Maskell warned that in some circles, the idea had gained ground that what makes the liturgy corporate is the fact that many people celebrate it at the same time, yet whether the communicants be few or many, the liturgy is essentially corporate because it is the act of Christ in the corpus mysticum. The idea of fellowship is being overstressed and can lead to the misinterpretation of the Eucharist being just a memorialist community meal, which certainly was not the intention of Herbert or his movement. In making the Eucharist the focal liturgy of the Church of England, we have exhibited a plurality of meanings. A memorial, a sacrifice, a thanksgiving, an eschatological banquet, a joyful meal of unity, a mystery, or for some, as a symbol of liberation. These many meanings, some bonding us to ecumenical partners, are a tribute to its continuing relevance and centrality in Western Christendom and its resurgence within the branches of Reformed Christianity. Gregory Dix, in his Shape of the Liturgy, wrote on the importance of the Eucharist, and I'm sure many of you will know this quite well. Was ever another commandment, do this in remembrance of me, so obeyed? Men have found no better thing to do for kings at their crowning and for criminals going to the scaffold, for armies in triumph, or a parliament, or a sick old woman afraid to die. Whilst the Great War had disrupted life, as it had been seen as a general mobilization, it was the Second World War that saw total disruption. Whilst there had been limited attacks by Axis powers towards the end of the Great War, the Second World War was the first total war. And this is acknowledged by mass evacuation of women and children from cities. The evacuation of choruses from St. Paul's to Western Cornwall has had some recent coverage. A number of other cathedrals in Southeast England evacuated their choruses for some or all the hostile period. Choruses at Durham were housed under the deanery in a room converted to act as dorm space come air raid shelter. It's actually now the private oratory of the Dean. Cathedrals on the warfront, especially those in the southeast, saw their choral worship diminished. Many were ingenious in trying to keep some choral activity going, voluntary choirs, use of women and girls, albeit not in cathedral choir mode at this stage. Cathedral musicians did their bit at the front. Examples include Alan Wicks, later to serve a distinguished period at Canterbury, serving in India with the 14th Punjab Regiment. Francis Jackson in Egypt, North Africa, and Italy with the 9th Lancers. David Wilcox, of course, was awarded the Military Cross in the Battle of Normandy in 1944. Like those in the previous generation, they returned from war to a changed world. But whilst cathedrals had, to a greater extent, continued as before, following the Great War, the return from the Second War saw huge societal changes for them to deal with. The Education Act of 1944, for instance, saw a reinvigorated seriousness in state education. Here, for the first time, the law divided, the division between primary and secondary education was enshrined in law. Its implementation saw a rise in educational standards for the entire population. Gone now were the days of choristers being able to get by singing and playing a good game of cricket alone. The state's enforcement of a general standard in education would come to see a change in the education and welfare of choristers. Many cathedrals post-war did not restore the regularly sung morning office. At York, this had been given to the choristers since the mid-20s and was only fully dropped in the 1950s. Cathedrals, of course, were not spared war damage. Coventry is a special case, and much research has been devoted to its destruction and subsequent rebuilding. But a number of cathedrals suffered lesser but significant damage. St. Paul's, which we see on the screen, Exeter and Llandaff are some examples that we can think of off the top of our heads. The pre-war economic malady exacerbated by the post-war economic state meant that serious investment and capital were not available without significant state or semi-state support well into the 1960s. Even then, the attempts to make do and mend were significantly weakened sticking plasters. So one example I've looked at is the organ rebuild at St. David's Cathedral. Their instruments had been condemned in the 1930s as failing, but ultimately, due to the finances and war supply issues or post-war supply issues, the rebuild in 1952 was of a weakened instrument. Costs naturally require compromise, but delivered the weakened instrument that was found not to be able to stand any additional change, leading it to fail completely in the mid-90s. So 40 years after it was built, it had died. I don't think it would be either outlandish or outrageous for me to suggest that we were still seeing cathedrals putting themselves right due to such make do and mend efforts well into this century, and likely as we progress through the century, we're going to see more and more architectural nightmares come to life. Here's hoping they're not too bad. Over the last 70 years, a lot of time has been spent discussing liturgical reform. Much has been written, both academically and practically. But if we were to look at it as a chronology, it wouldn't set the world right. Whilst limited experimental work was undertaken on initiation rites in the late 1950s, and that was only confined to the province of York, the archbishops recommended a set of revisions known as Series 1 to be commended for use from 1966. In essence, Series 1 consisted of extracts from the 28 prayer book, which, having pushed the bounds of legality in being commended for use by both archbishops since the mid-1940s, diocesan bishops had been sotto voce saying, use it, but don't make a fuss about it, since 1928. Many were now being presented by a rite individually for use. Both the marriage rite and the burial rite are still authorized for use from Series 1. Incredibly, when we look at recent state liturgies, it's to Series 1 we look, not to the 1662. The confirmation rite of Series 1 didn't receive the necessary 2/3 majority to proceed from the church assembly. It was the only liturgical failure of the group. The Series 1 communion rite largely reflected the 28 suggestions. However, there were two options to follow the words of institution. One which reflected the 1928 rite, and one which was an uncontentious tying of the prayer of oblation to the consecration prayer. If they'd done that in 1928, the book might have passed. That's quite a simplistic view of it. An explicit epiclesis was still, however, some way off. The Series 1 communion rite was the first to allow congregational responses in intercessions. Interpolations of Lord, hear our prayer, and let our cry come unto thee were later replaced by Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer, that we know and somewhat say in our sleep these days. The language, however, remained notably Cranmerian. The following year, Series 2 was brought alongside to parallel Series 1. Now, Series 2 remained in traditional language. However, whilst God remained in these and thous, it was less Cranmerian, and it pointed towards a model to come. Shorter prayers, responsiveness between minister and congregation, akin to the pantomime, he's behind you. The architects of the Series 2 communion rite, Radcliffe and Arthur Curtin, firmly rooted themselves in the Catholic tradition, heavily influenced by the parish communion movement. In terms of length, Curtin and Radcliffe constructed a liturgy that would be hard-pressed to go for over an hour. But however modern this liturgy was, the use of antiquated mock Tudor language remained an anachronism. The publication of the Jerusalem Bible in 1966 and the New English Bible in 1971 provided scriptural impetus for liturgy in a modern idiom. Stimulated by the publication of new biblical translations, the Liturgical Commission published Modern Liturgical Texts in 1968. The Ecumenical International Consultation on English Texts in the Liturgy produced 3 reports between 1968 and 75, agreeing definitive modern language texts for use across denominations. So many of us will remember in the previous Roman Missal how we would recognize the Creed, the Lord's Prayer, the Sanctus, the Gloria. Out of that, it came before they reverted to being faithful to the Latin. But the Lord's Prayer, however, became a sticking point. Lead us not into temptation for the Church of England could not be translated satisfactorily and became a major sticking point in every future liturgical revision. Even now, the 1928 version of the Lord's Prayer is used as default, even at worship in modern language. A text everyone knows changed beyond recognition into, as one detractor loudly claimed it, as church speak, is something that still triggers and proves difficult to swallow, even in a room of open-minded churchgoers. I'd be interested to see if anyone actually uses the modern language Lord's Prayer in their liturgies, in their congregational liturgies. I know one place that does, but even then you'll hear it ricocheting, lead us not into temptation, and who art, and even which art in heaven, which, you know, at a moment of unity just makes a mockery of it. Work on the calendar and the lectionary followed in tandem with a new spirit of ecumenism and Anglo-centralism, with much of the resulting work on lectionary emanating from the United States. But one event above all in this period truly showed that the C of E had learned its lessons from 1928. The arrival of synodical government in 1970 removed much of the legislative burden of the church from having to progress through Parliament. Toward the end of the First Synod, the authorization of the Church of England Worship and Doctrine Measure 1974 granted to the Synod power to produce and authorize forms of service without recourse to Parliament, providing that the unaltered 1662 book remained as a regularly available alternative liturgical source. While some would hastily and happily try and forget this, the law is clear. The 1662 book remains the benchmark. The 60s and 70s were a time of growth. They were also a time of change, and decisions were being made. In this period, we see the Kiel Conference, where evangelicals within the church are given the opportunity to join with their nonconformist brethren, all to remain faithful to the church and within the Church of England. John Stott's passionate speech after Martin Lloyd-Jones's invitation for the evangelical wing to come and join nonconformist brethren remains a cornerstone for evangelical movements still within the Church of England, and their ultimate decision to stay is a legacy still being worked out. The culmination of the liturgical movement in the Roman Catholic Church with the Second Vatican Council saw an immense effect on the Catholic movement within our own church. Save for a few shrines, Catholic parishes adopted the Novus Ordo in tandem with English and Roman developments, again leaving a legacy that we continue to see today throughout our church. Music in the post-war era saw a creative revival. We see a divergence emerge between compositions by those who were composers, serious art composers. And if we talk about Britain and we talk about Howells, and we see them, they're not only, we think of some of their church work, but actually their main corpus is in other mediums. And by those who compose from within the church or for the church music world. And I'm being quite broad in that to include some organ works too. The advent of a government-backed arts council saw funding available for commissioning of new music and often serious music. Arts and culture received a tangible boost by the Festival of Britain in 1951. Encouraging a patchwork of local and regional festivals of music making to take place and develop in the succeeding decades. And up until reasonably recently, Arts Council or Arts Quango money often was lay behind a great deal of our big commissions. I was about to say Bernstein and the Chichester Psalms, but I know that isn't strictly true for Chichester. But if you think of composers such as Britten and Michael Tippett being able to be lured away from opera and other serious works to write specific canticles, more often than not, that included Arts Council money. Following on from earlier interrogation of Tudor and early music sources that we spoke about last week, we see a proper resurgence in interest in activity in early modern music. Researchers such as Dennis Stevens and Bob Thurston Dart and musicians such as Alfred Deller brought forward research and practice that would fire a resurgence, building interest in editing and restoring principal and secondary works of the major and minor composers of the Tudor and Jacobite eras. This came at a great time because it was at the zenith of mass scale recording and interest in authentic performance practice, which led to the explosion of the early music movement of the 1970s. The idea of mass recording, of being able to hire someone to come in and do a recording of your choir, really began in the 1950s with the advent of mass-produced record players, and that benefited the English choral tradition greatly. Hannah Rieken, who in her research on English church music and its effects in the Low Countries, tells us of the Anglican virus which permeated the Netherlands and Belgium in the 1950s, mostly driven by recordings of David Wilcox at King's College, Cambridge. By the late 80s, there were 100 choirs in the Low Countries regularly performing English church repertoire, either as part of a regular concerts program, working it into their own liturgy within their own churches, or in some cases, either performing it as a staged concert liturgy, or as something very recognizable to us as by the 1662 prayer book. The opportunity to travel in that era increased European cooperation, and together with advances in radio and broadcast technology, allowed for the dissemination of the art form not only to traditional Anglosphere countries, but to the continent and even as far as Japan. And if you talk to people now who are interested in choral music around the world, many of whom will have first come to that through carols from kings. And so carols from kings and our larger state occasions offered and continue to offer a huge opportunity for intercultural exchange. I was in Boston at the time of Her Late Majesty's funeral, and attending church the previous day was drawn into a conversation of what the next day's ceremonies and music might look like. The only thing that everyone agreed on was that it would musically be unparalleled and that the worship would be fitting. So it's a fitting tribute to all those who worked for years on those services and putting them together. But in my view, and from, and so many of our views, the music and worship of that sad day met incredibly high standards. So revision up to this point remained conservative in language, in liturgical expression, and ideals. Series 3, the modern language rites, came into use on February the 1st, 1973. The Series 3 communion rite was not only a modern language, but took on the spirit of the age. The rite encouraged greater use of seasonal material woven in to enrich the static text. The use of silence was encouraged. One could even argue over-egged. There are 13 instances within that rite, which was not meant to last more than an hour. Intercessions, again, are a dialogue between minister and congregation. The peace, either the highlight or bane of our lives in a Eucharist, first became mandatory in an English rite for the first time since the Reformation. However, all the kissy-huggy stuff associated with it, that was the spirit of the age, and that's not historically accurate. The priest is identified for the first time as president. That's an important innovation in understanding the presidency of the rite in one minister. For Anglo-Catholics, following the spirit of Vatican II, this acknowledged the singularity of presidency in the priest. For evangelicals, it moved hesitancy in the use of sacerdotal language. But let's not kid ourselves. This was neither a radical nor progressive text. The service was a modern language updating of Series 2. The alternative greeting at the start of Sursum Corda, the Lord is here, his spirit is with us, remains little understood, although Ronald Jasper, who chaired the Liturgical Commission at this time, attempts to make a convincing case for it. With the completion of Series 2 and 3, we see a throughway to the ASB, the Alternative Service Book, in 1980. Some further experimentation had taken place, but most of what appeared in, as the satirical magazine Private Eye described it at the time as the Rocky Horror Service Book, was directly spawned out of Series 2 and 3. For all its fault, there is some forward movement. ground has been gained. We see acceptance of prayers for the departed. The Eucharistic prayers, 4 to choose from, reflected compromise and a grown-up acceptance of divergence. It introduces us to the Brindley-Beckwith canon, which was Eucharistic prayer 2 in ASB and now lives on as prayer B in common worship, which was drawn from the 3rd century Hippolytus of Rome and improved the second Eucharistic prayer of the Roman Missal, in my opinion. And it remains a huge push forward for many Anglo-Catholics, especially those formed in the Novus Ordo tradition. The 4th Eucharistic prayer, based on the 1928 rite, squared the circle in terms of acceptability for language on sacrificial offering, the most offering that most rooters in the centre could easily take. The theological undergirding of the Eucharist is stronger than in any previous liturgical book in the Church of England. In almost every prayer, the anamnesis, the recollection, is understood as making effective in the present a profoundly significant event of the past, as was the case also in the Jewish Passover. In the communion rites of the ASB, the Church continues to make a perpetual memorial of Christ's death, and his members, united with God and one another, give thanks for all his mercies, entreat the benefits of his passion on behalf of the whole Church, participate in those benefits, and enter into the movement of his self-offering. Whilst I could go on about the communion rite and other aspects of the ASB, and the move towards its theological undergirding, which is clearly continued in common worship, time needs to be allowed to cover the book in the widest sense. The production of a 2,000-page book, detractors referring to it as something the size of a house brick, followed the prayer book tradition of all necessary resources being in one place. One could argue that the daily office provision in it is weak. Re-engagement started almost immediately after publication and came to its intended culmination in common worship daily prayer. The inclusion of the 2-year lectionary within the book was one that helped age it quickly, especially as by the mid-90s, it had been agreed that the entire Anglican Communion would move from a 2-year to a 3-year lectionary. Theoretically, what you are hearing at church in Boston or in Melbourne or in Cape Town or in Harare would be the same readings you would hear in Salisbury or Chichester or York or Hebden Bridge. Like any human construct, the ASB had flaws and some notable detractors, but it did manage to move forward liturgical revision and engage and set alight a new generation of ministers and laity to push ahead. But the ASB, notably, was always meant to be a long-term experiment. Originally planned as a 10-year authorized period, it was quickly extended to a 20-year authorization period. Although some parts of it managed to make their silver jubilee, the ordination rite actually managed to last till well after the book had finished. Together with authorized, commended, and author-led supplements of resources, the 20-year period, 1980 to 2000, saw experimentation that would be refined and finessed into common worship. So whilst many on Advent Sunday 2000 thought they were getting a whole new book, in fact, a lot of it was an old familiar friend that had survived the synodical tactical tweaking. Having learned from the ASB that a time-led authorization period for the entire work bound the Church too deeply, the fathers of common worship, all of whom had cut their teeth in the 70s and 80s revisions, knew that it had to be brought online by the Church as an evolving process, with continual revision, reworking and understanding as the Church itself continually evolved, revised, and gained itself new understanding. I don't really intend to speak very much in depth about common worship, which will surprise a few of you, because we are continuing to experience it today, and day by day, week by week, in our places of worship. Those of you who might be watching later outside of England may be surprised to learn that much of our worship in the Anglican tradition has begun to converge, many drawing on Gregory Dix's structure from the shape of the liturgy, rather than obsessing on the exactness and commonality of core texts. Common worship has seen 7 core books published. At least one has received a very early revision. Further resources, such as alternative collects and additional Eucharistic rites for children, and an alternative baptismal rite, have now been added. The preference of shape over text has allowed creativity and option to abound in an unprecedented manner. In theory, whilst you should be able to go into any church and recognize core shape and some mandatory texts, the canticles, creed, and Eucharistic prayers are protected from interference and allegedly cannot be supplanted. The locality of any rite allows a greater diversity of liturgical practices since the pre-Reformation local rites. So in some ways, we've gone full circle. Some of you might be disappointed to learn that I decided not to do a musical case study or talk in depth about composers in this period. But there's a reason for that. And it's because at no greater time have we been able to access the glories and the richness of the past 500-600 years worth of church music. The past half century has seen the dissemination of cathedral music to audiences unimaginable to Byrd or Tallis, Blow or Purcell, or even Stainer and Stanford. Through broadcast and recording, choirs were and are able to share repertoire with a wider audience than ever before. Whilst no one can doubt that greater commercialisation has naturally permeated, we can cast our minds back a few weeks to the 17th and 18th centuries, where choristers were hired out for commercial entertainment. What we do see in the post-World War II era is the division in composition, as I touched on earlier, the split between church music composers and Western art composers. There is some crossover. It would be unfair of me to say that the camps are, set in stone. If you look at someone like Francis Jackson, who is a church music composer, but whilst he was a great devotee of Bairstow, his musical kind of inspiration and kind of compositional mentor was Ravel. And it was to Ravel's recordings and scores he returned just as much as he did to his directing and organ father Bairstow. Whilst he and Healy Willan in Canada were rooted firmly in church music, like Stanford, they were able to pick up the skills that they'd gained through a wider exposure to Western art music and enrich their compositions and kind of destroy that binary box idea of church music and music, if we are going to be that binary. I do take issue with people I've often heard people make fun of church composers, and I think that's actually quite cruel, because if you listen to something, it affects you. So in the last section, I've tried to be very careful in my language, because all listening affects composers and has an effect on their composition. So trying to say, oh, because someone makes a pretty tune, makes them a church composer, and that's about it, it's insulting to them. And is something often said by academic musicians who spend most of their time in music departments rather than making their life as composers. But there's my handbag put away on that. But compositionally, we are at a peak, we are at a zenith, because British and European composers of all walks of life are engaging with the art form and have produced, over the recent years, works of profound beauty and reverence. Recording and broadcast naturally has changed the nature of the beast. A Rocky Tuesday Evensong that not long ago, would have been only heard by a handful of people. Now, due to live streaming and listen again facilities, can be heard on repeat and, you know, for those so minded, recorded for posterity. The half-life of this is worrying, because that's not what the Anglican, the cathedral music tradition is about. It's about singing that one service and then it's behind you. So recent changes that we've seen through COVID has in some ways greatened the reputational risk. Because we're used to hearing choirs perform perfectly in recordings and broadcasts, the live daily round is live. Things can and sometimes do go wrong. So our capacity for accepting that can be diminished in the quest for the unobtainable, that of professional performing quality for all things day in and day out. How we manage that going forward is a question perplexing even the most professional of musicians in our field, and one that we will see coming to fruition in the choir schools, song schools, and dare I say, over the post-rehearsal pint for decades to come. But we live in interesting times. In terms of exposure, of quality, of musicianship, we live in a golden age of cathedral music. In worship, we see, however, the inevitable dropping off following an age of wider experimentation. The age of devising and developing has come to an end. Now comes the age of use. This inevitably begs a number of questions. In terms of common worship, we see a resource that ever grows and can be amended. Yet, we saw during the pandemic, many clergy yearn for something more pastorally suitable in a time of uncertainty and of loss. The permissiveness and work needed to craft a liturgy Sunday by Sunday began to push even the most liturgically minded. It's clear that there isn't appetite for liturgical revision at present. Given how slowly revision has taken previously, one could imagine some limited engagement within the next decade or so. But as the fathers of common worship envisaged, this will dock alongside rather than be something requiring an entirely new composition. As we recently saw with the authorization of the alternative baptismal rites, revision is able to come alongside the core rite without all hell breaking loose. Cathedrals are, on the whole, recovering remarkably well from COVID in a musical sense, but none of us are naive enough to ignore that funding, changes in governance, and the nature and essence of cathedrals are changing before our eyes. Finance is a continual worry. Music is a large expenditure department, and whilst it would be a courageous chapter who would try and axe a choir completely, many finance directors would breathe a sigh of relief if savings could be made. Little work has been done in exploring alternative models of delivery. One can assume that even acknowledging that there are alternative models would be to some seen as a slippery slope. I agree with that fear, but better to have something on the back of an envelope than to be defenestrated by a chapter and finance director. The era in which musicians can count on the support wholeheartedly of their deans and chapters sadly has passed. The usual route of Oxbridge Chapel, then on to ordination, is steadily decreasing in the senior leadership of our church. Many will have come to faith later, and the emotional and spiritual attachment of music and worship cannot automatically be counted upon being of our tradition. In parishes, the near rejection of church music by a certain generation of clergy has, with of course notable exceptions, seen the idea of the parish choir as a performing ensemble disappear from regular sight. Whilst I don't believe the same fate will ever befall cathedral choirs, we do have to be alert to changing dynamics and remain vigilant to developing arguments with regards to finance and support. The explosion in live streaming broadcasts through COVID has been a blessing to many, but as I mentioned earlier, this puts intense pressure on musicians in working towards broadcast levels of performance. The present structure of cathedral choirs makes this, in my view, unsustainable in the long term without a serious constriction of repertoire. The glory of the English choral tradition, especially into cathedrals, is the fact that a huge corpus of music is performed. A return to the 18th century canticles and anthem on rota would be disappointing, to say the least, and demonstrate a risk aversion that needs active avoidance. Pushing a choir to its limit, not every day, but on occasion, and taking risks with repertoire really does keep musicians on their toes. And even if it does go wrong, there is an excitement that keeps the musicians striving. The safe and secure behavior of the late 17th and early 18th centuries demonstrate that this model is not beneficial in the long term. COVID has thrust underlying structural issues within the church to the fore. It would be wrong for anyone to claim all was fine and then there was COVID, as it wasn't. But the long-term response that will play out for a decade, maybe even 2 or 3, will determine the next part of the journey. For the moment, that's our non-existent 7th lecture, one that we will experience through the music and liturgy in an onward journey together. Thank you. So if anyone would like to ask some questions, I'd be delighted. And if you want me to try and do 2 seconds on any of your composers, especially the 20th century, I'm happy to do that now. Everyone's being very quiet. Do you have any questions?
Well, I was going to ask you, Ben. Of course, we're in a church in which the language of mission is predominant. What is the missional value of cathedral music? So, of course, many people just think it's just a bit indulgent, a bit Radio 3.
It is, and we have to. We can't argue that. We can't argue that. I think trying to argue it is a bad idea. But I was at Southwark Cathedral last night with the Cathedral Music Trust, and Andrew Nunn, the Dean of Southwark, in the way that he does, gave us this welcome, which was both personal and just managed to get the nub of it in 20 seconds. He, in welcoming us to Southwark, he had the choir. Which is both sets of choristers, boys and girls, singing. They all come from schools from across London. They're state educated. But Father Andrew talked to us about his journey of faith through music, and that's basic. And the nub of it was he wouldn't be Dean of Southwark if he had not gone and sang in the choir age 7. And he told us that, that grounding, that experience opened his life to possibilities that someone from his background would never have had. The choristers behind him come from a wide demographic mix. That opportunity for them will open doors that they and their parents would never possibly imagine. If you ever tune into Classic FM and they're playing some core music and Sandra Armstrong's presenting, Sandra does a much better rallying cry than me for this, and it's brilliant. But it's social mobility in action, it's education in action. It's mental health awareness in action. Taking 45 minutes out of your day to sit and be. One of the great things about the daily offices. And we've slightly lost that by becoming, a mass-centered church. And and although that's what feeds me spiritually. The importance of the offices and being able to sit and be, whether you believe or not, is one that's incredible. You can just turn up, and you can sit and you can let it all wash over you. And if you're a musician, you can just experience this wide corpus of music, from 5, 6, 7 centuries, from Germany, from Italy, from Scandinavia, from the United States and Canada, from South America even. There is something for everyone, and we've not always been really good at expressing that, and we're catching up quite quickly. Fortunately, you've got organisations like Cathedral Music Trust out there telling the story, being forward with the narrative, and showing how great it is, not just only within the church, but to the wider world.
Hello, I was wondering if you could say anything about how important church music is in the wider music ecology today, whether there are enough sufficient young composers coming up who are interested in composing for the church.
Well, that's actually an exciting thing. And which is why I was kind of garbling and trying to hedge my bets when talking about composers and church music earlier. A lot of composers now are willing to engage, and especially young composers, because there is this. I don't want to kind of get too political. But obviously, academic music departments are very, can be quite politically charged, and so you can see that there is, church music's a bit like, it's a bit naff, but that has seemed to have passed. And if you look at young composers, you've got Carenza Briggs out there. There are plenty of others who are, starting out, and they are writing across the medium. You'll find them, you'll find them writing things for choirs. You'll find them writing experimental works for dance, and one clarinet and maraca. And that's what music's about. There is meant to be this interchangeability, because there always has been. If you look at Bow and Purcell, they weren't just writing for Chapel Royal, they were writing for the stage. They were writing to keep their patrons happy. Same with Bird, same with Tomkins, and you just have, you're working for your patron. And, you'll find in the back rows of cathedrals, in the provincial cathedrals, maybe a bit more that they're all teachers, or or maybe have careers, and then do it as a kind of, as sing in the background as a passion. But certainly in London and kind of the southeast, you've got more professional musicians in your back row who are, combining their clerkship with, being in the course of the Opera House, or being on stage at the Barbican at 7:45 and getting out of even song at 6:15. How many other walks of life can say that? It's marvelous, and as I said earlier, we don't sell it terribly well. I think church musicians, and I think in this part of the church, we're a bit of a closed shop. You have to know how to come in and get into all this and be excited by it. And we're not good at telling people who don't get it. We're not good at communicating with them. We need to get better. And there are people out there who are fab at it. Seriously, Alexander Armstrong is going to do a lot of kind of talking up of choristerships and ball stuff over Christmas on Classic FM. So please do, if you listen, I heard him speak last night, and it's just amazing. You just want to stand up and put his, do a kind of Kitchener, your country needs you, type poster with his face on it for choristers, because you'd just be moved by it. It is, it has so much to give, and we've not been good at selling it, and we need to get better. And now there are, and of course there are always exceptions to this, but now with the changes in dynamics in cathedrals and the church itself, we can't count on, we can't count on turning to our deans and our bishops in the way that we maybe once did. Maybe we were naive to do that. Maybe that was a bit too comfortable slipper. But now we've got to work for it, and we've really got to do our job, and sing our own praises and be able to tell that to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's probably a good rallying cry at the end there, Ben. Maybe it's a good place to end. Thank you so much over these past 7 weeks of these 6 sessions. I've learned a huge amount, as I'm sure many others who joined, and I had a few apologies today, people who were saying how much they've appreciated it, who couldn't be here tonight, but a big thank you. Yeah, well, hopefully invite you back at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be great. It would be great to kind of follow up and do but maybe carve out some things, because this was when we started off, we kind of worked this as a kind of this was going to be a skim, and actually as I've gone through it, there've been points I thought, ooh, I wish I could have gone just a little bit more into that and indulged. So yeah, maybe we can look at that at some point.
And if you're longing to learn, do more theology at the moment, we've got the Reformation is tomorrow night, and Clues are taking us through that. So do have a look on the website. With also we've got the Orthodoxy in the new year, and some Dominican spirituality, and there's something else already lined up. Bonhoeffer, I think, yes. So plenty more to come. And in the meantime, I hope you all make the most of the choral feasts that await us in Advent. And it's been wonderful to share this time with you all. And wish you all a pleasant evening, and hope to see you at some other Cathedral Theology Network events. Great. Take care, everyone. Bye, Alison.
Bye.